Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hope you're doing well. I wanted to continue our reading of the Federalist Papers. Haven't dug into it in a while. I mean, we've done quite a few videos of this series, and I think it's really important for people who like political science and want to know the Americana 17th century mindset to read these works. This is still in the essay of Alexander Hamilton, okay? And obviously he's talking about the Union, stability, pretty much the same vein topic that we've been going on for a while in this series. If you need to catch up, just go to the playlist and check it out. But go ahead and listen to this as you are in your garden, you're on your bike, walking down by the beach, hiking, got your AirPods in. Keep one out though so you can have a security mindset and relax. Let's begin. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Let us attend to what would be the effects of this situation in the very first war in which we should happen to be engaged. We will presume, for argument's sake, that the revenue arising from the impost duties answers the purpose of a provision for the public debt and of peace establishment for the Union. Thus circumstance, a war breaks out. What would be the probable conduct of the government in such an emergency? Okay. A war breaks out. What's the government likely to do? Taught by experience that proper dependence could not be placed on the success of requisitions, unable by its own authority to lay hold of fresh resources, and urged by considerations of national danger. So urged by considerations of national danger. Would it not be driven to the expedient of diverting the funds already appropriated from their proper objects to the defense of the state? Okay, so diverting funds to now the defense of the state. So things will get cut. It is not easy to see how a step of this kind could be avoided, and if it should be taken, it is evident that it would prove the destruction of public credit at the very moment that it was becoming essential to public safety. To imagine that at such a crisis credit might be dispensed with would be the extreme of infatuation. In the modern system of war, nations, the most wealthy, are obliged to have recourse to large loans. Okay, so recourse to large loans. Modern system of war. A country so little opulent as ours must feel this necessity in a much stronger degree. But who would lend to a government that prefaced its overtures for borrowing by an act which demonstrated that no reliance could be placed on the steadiness of its measures for paying? Brilliant. So who's going to lend to somebody who they feel can't repay it back? So in order for a government to get the loan, they need to have some type of steadiness to their economy. The trust in being able to pay it back. The loan it might be able to procure would be as limited in their extent as burdensome in their conditions. Okay, so the loan could entail burdensome conditions. They would be made upon the same principle that usurers commonly lend to bankrupt and fraudulent debtors, with a sparing hand and an enormous premiums. Ooh, ain't that the truth? So, principles of usury. So, those who are really fond of usury, he contends, they will gladly, seems like they to bankrupt and fraudulent debtors. they're gonna get more back if they can get some of that back eventually, right? They got time to kill. The interest comes up. Enormous premiums. It may perhaps be imagined that from the scantiness of the resources of the country, the necessity of diverting the established funds in the case supposed would exist, though the national government should possess an unrestrained power of taxation. Ooh. What? The national government should possess an unrestrained power of taxation. Taxation is pretty brutal now, but two considerations will serve to quiet all apprehension on this head. One is that we are sure the resources of the community in their full extent will be brought into activity for the benefit of the Union. So taxes being used for the benefit of the Union. The other is that whatever deficiencies there may be can without difficulty be supplied by loans. So throwing money at it. The power of creating new funds upon new objects of taxation by its own authority would enable the national government to borrow as far as its necessities might require. Dang. Brutal. So, the power of creating new funds upon new objects of taxation. New objects of taxation. That would enable the government to borrow as far as needs be. So this sounds to me like, oh yeah, so we're going to take this loan. How are we going to pay you back? We'll create a new tax for the people. That sounds brutal. So that's, I mean, it makes sense from his perspective, how you'd pay back the loan, but it's brutal that means less money for the people. But then they would argue, well, it's national security. You want to be safe, don't you? So let us take more of your money. You live in poverty. We'll promise to spend it on defense. And what is that? What does defense mean? Well, we're going to call everything scary, and to justify all this spending and keep you in a perpetual state of paranoia so that you never want to be taxed less. Hell, maybe we'll tax you at 80% and you'll beg us because you want security and you're not ready to defend yourself and you're dependent on us. So just keep handing over that money. Go back to work. 80 hours a week, you never see your family, can't keep none of your money, you're drowning in debt, you don't want to have more taxes. That's too bad. We have national security problems. Think about it. Oh, Israel and Ukraine need tax money? Oh, your community is more violent than those areas? Almost. There's people dying every day from drug overdoses and gangs? Nah, you can handle it. By the way, we're going to take $1 more for your check. It's going to increase however we want, but you'll be fine. You'll be fine. You don't have food for your kid? Oh, you're fine. You got McDonald's around the corner? Oh, you have diabetes, you can't eat that stuff? Too bad. Foreigners, as well as the citizens of America, could then be reasonably repose confidence in all its engagements. But to depend upon a government that must itself depend upon 13 other governments for the means of fulfilling its contracts, when once its situation is clearly understood, would require a degree of credulity not often to be met within the pecuniary transactions of mankind. Credulity, pecuniary, and little reconcilable with the usual sharp-sightedness of avarice. Sharp-sightedness of avarice. Reflections of this kind may have trifling weight with men who hope to see realized in America the halcyon scenes of the poetic or fabulous age, but to those who believe we are likely to experience a common portion of the vicissitudes and calamities which have fallen to the lot of other nations, they must appear entitled to serious attention. Such men must behold the actual situation of their country with painful solicitude, and deprecate the evils which ambition or revenge might with too much facility inflict upon him. Ambition, revenge, it's wild. Publius. Well, dang, Alexander. You made some sense with taxes, but you're making me fear it. We need less taxes now. Number 31. The same subject continued. Alexander Hamilton. No more taxes. In disquisitions of every kind, there are certain primary truths, or first principles, upon which all subsequent reasonings must depend. These contain an internal evidence which, antecedent to all reflection or combination, commands the assent of the mind. So commands the assent of the mind, where it produces not this effect, it must proceed either from some disorder in the organs of perception, or from the influence of some strong interest or passion, or prejudice of this nature, or the maxims in geometry, that the whole is greater than its parts, that things equal to the same are equal to one another, that two straight lines cannot enclose a space, and that all right. Oh, that's interesting. The two straight lines cannot enclose a space, because if they're two lines, they have to have the space in order to be two different lines. And that all right angles are equal to each other. Of the same nature are these other maxims in ethics and politics, that there cannot be an effect without a cause, that the means ought to be proportioned to the end. So the means be proportioned to the end, that every power ought to be commensurate with its object, that there ought to be no limitation of a power destined to effect a purpose which is itself incapable of limitation. And there are other truths in the two latter sciences which, if they cannot pretend to rank in the class of axioms, are yet such direct inferences from them, and so obvious in themselves, and so agreeable to the natural and unsophisticated dictates of common sense, that they challenge the assent of a sound and unbiased mind with a degree of force and conviction almost equally irresistible. Okay, so that they challenge the assent of a sound, unbiased mind, unsophisticated dictates of common sense, the objects of geometrical inquiry are so entirely abstracted from those pursuits which stir up and put in motion the unruly passions of the human heart, that mankind without difficulty adopt not only the more simple theorems of the science, but even those abstruse paradoxes which, however they may appear susceptible of demonstration, are at variance with the natural conceptions which the mind, without the aid of philosophy, would be led to entertain upon the subject. The infinite divisibility of matter, or in other words, the infinite divisibility of a finite thing, extending even to the minutest atom, is at a point agreed among geometricians, though not less incomprehensible to common sense than any of those mysteries in religion against which the batteries of infidelity have been so industriously leveled. Industriously leveled? The batteries of infidelity. So, maxims, commands the ascent of the mind, the two straight lines cannot enclose a space. He's really quite poetic in his opening here. This is going to be a great introduction. But in the science of morals and politics, men are found far less tractable. So he's really comparing, the world of math and physics to that of politics and morals and ethics, essentially. To a certain degree, it is right and useful that this should be the case. Caution and investigation are necessary armor against error and imposition. This is really true. Okay? We're told as Muslims to verify something before. Like before spreading it, like if someone comes to you with information, verify it. Don't just believe it outright. Investigate. See. If you keep yourself cautious, this will help you be more skeptical and avoid, medical propaganda, war propaganda, fake news, and scammers, right? You investigate into things and take caution. Beware of just the great rhetorician or the great preacher, right? You gotta make sure what's true is true. And you have to be willing to look for the truth, be a truth seeker. But this unattractableness may be carried too far and may degenerate into obstinacy, perverseness, or disingenuity, though it cannot be pretended that the principles of moral and political knowledge have, in general, the same energy of certainty with those of the mathematics. So the degree of certainty. So mathematics is more certain than the world of politics and the principle of morality codes. Yet they have much better claims in this respect than to judge from the conduct of men. In particular situations, we should be disposed to allow them. The obscurity is much oftener in the passions and prejudices of the reasoner than in the subject. This is a very good point. Nuance can be obscure and vague. Sometimes it's quite obvious. But there's always going to be that prejudice, that bias within the reasoner for every subject. So, if we know that, we take caution and investigate. Understand that we have to not be fully biased. We have our morals, but we don't want to be so open-minded that our head falls out. But not so narrow-minded that we can't become better. Men, upon too many occasions, do not give their own understandings fair play. Oh, okay. See? So give your mind some fair play. But yielding to some untoward bias, they entangle themselves in words and confound them in subtleties. Yes, that's true. Sometimes you don't try to use your brain, you just go with what someone said. You doubt yourself, but you don't doubt them. You let them think for you, and you don't think for yourself. There's a balance, right? Know when to ask for help, and know when to trust your judgment. How else could it happen if we admit the objectors to be sincere in their opposition? That position so clear as those which manifest the necessity of a general power of taxation in the government of the Union should have to encounter any adversaries among men of discernment. So, pointing out the necessity for a general force that can levy taxes. So, the federal government. This would be like those who want anarchy, no taxation. he's just pointing out the balance. Like, if you're wise, you kind of can see that you need some form of federal government here. This is what I'm getting from his reading thus far. Thus, these positions have been elsewhere fully stated. They will perhaps not be improperly recapitulated in this place as introductory to an examination of what may have been offered by way of objection to them. They are in substance as follows. Let's see. He's going to lay out some stuff for us. A government ought to contain in itself every power requisite to the full accomplishment of the objects committed to its care, and to complete execution of them of the trust for which it is responsible, free from every other control but a regard to the public good and the sense of the people. Okay, public good, sense of the people. So, government needs to have a way of just fulfilling and accomplishing its tasks. Its main task, to fulfill and protect what it's committed to care for. Yeah, to complete the execution of the trust. You're trusted with the objects you're committed to take care for. You're responsible for that. So, if something has more control over you, and you're failing to execute your trusts, and you're failed in taking care of the objects committed to you, you're not going to be in a very effective government. So, you need to be free from control. You have to exercise your authority with less bureaucratic jams. And if it's something that regards the public good and it has a sense of the people, there shouldn't be so many impediments to the fulfilling of those trusts and the finishing of those goals and tasks. That's what I'm getting from him. As the duties of superintending the national defense. Okay, so there's the duty of securing national defense and of securing the public peace against foreign or domestic violence, involve a provision for casualties and dangers to which no possible limits can be assigned. So no possible limits. It's important to secure public peace. So securing public peace. Liberals have failed to do that in California. Okay. National defense. So neoliberals and neoconservatives have been warmongering, calling everything a threat to national security. It's a very tricky thing. Nikki Haley, oh, Israel's threatened, that's our national security threat. And it's like, how so? Nikki Haley said, Israel doesn't need America, America needs Israel. And if you look how much money we give them, you're like, how does... What? Oh, they're established in the region, so their success is our success, so you have to give your tax money to them. And you're like, I think you're just stretching the term national security to be constant warmongering and regime change wars. Because someone in Kentucky, someone in Alabama, like, why do they need to be taxed more and have their money looted from their local communities to fund the war machine, which fills the pockets of the military-industrial complex, weapon manufacturers, and destroys the lives of the people over there and here? Like, what is going on? So, national defense is an abused term. Because you can see here how Alexander is making a point. Yeah, you want to defend the nation. You need to have the money to do that. The collective union good. But your politicians saying we're going to have public peace against foreign aggression are actually creating foreign aggression due to their warmongering across the world and spreading military bases in so many countries and then saying, 3 troops died, so now we gotta go bomb the crap out of them. It's like, what? You can't, they're just like poking so many bears. Right? So this is interesting. So he's saying no possible limits can be assigned. It's like this is a very interesting conversation, to say the least. Because you're like, if you limit on the defense, then that can make you vulnerable and collapse, right? But if you don't put a cap and check and power on them, and your governments become corrupt, well, now you see that your country is getting depleted and drained. You can drain a country by dragging out wars for years, and America just can't stop warmongering, right? You got so many broken homes, so many gangs. It's a disaster. Public schools are a disaster. Even water quality is down. Infrastructure is crumbling, but they're like, no, get a vacuum out the pockets of the working class. Push people into poverty. Just suck it up for the war machine. It's wild. The power of making that provision ought to know no other bounds than the exigencies of the nation and the resources of the community. As revenue is the essential engine, so revenue is the essential engine. So when we call the military-industrial complex a machine, an engine is in a machine. Revenue is tax money. Taxpayers funding the military machine, by which the means of answering the national exigencies must be procured. The power of procuring that article in its full extent must necessarily be comprehended in that of providing for those exigencies. You can see the nobleness of what he's saying, right? You can understand that he's like, hey, you know, people, but they had way less taxes back then, right? Bloated government spending, programs, you know, it's a strange thing. How much capital will you allow people to keep? How much surplus will they be allowed to have? Will they always be bare bones? There has to be a point where the people have to have relief and some type of spending money. If everyone's so depleted that they have nothing to spend, you won't have money for your military machine. It's unless you create this sort of just permanent slave class. As theory and practice conspire to prove that the power of procuring revenue is unavailing when exercised over the states in their collective capacities, the federal government must of necessity be invested with an unqualified power of taxation in the ordinary modes. So, the federal government must of necessity be invested with an unqualified power of taxation in the ordinary modes. So, taxes. Federal government being able to levy a tax on you. Did not experience evince the contrary, it would be natural to conclude that the propriety of a general power of taxation in the national government might safely be permitted to rest on the evidence of these propositions, unassisted by any additional arguments or illustrations. But we find, in fact, that the antagonists of the proposed Constitution, so far from acquiescing to their justness or truth, seem to make their principal and most zealous effort against this part of the plan. It may therefore be satisfactory to analyze the arguments with which they combat it. Well, yes, obviously. So they're like, hey, just get your hands out of my pockets. How much power should the government have? States' rights versus federal rights. Jurisdictions, essentially. Those of them which have been most labored with, that view seem in substance to amount to this. It is not true, because the exigencies of the Union may not be susceptible of limitation, that its power of laying taxes ought to be unconfined. Okay, so unconfined power of taxation. Revenue is a requisite to the purpose of a local administrations as to those of the Union, and the former are at least of equal importance with the latter to the happiness of the people. So key point here. Revenue. Our tax money is the revenue of the government. The more revenue they demand, the less money we have. Okay? The more you have to blindly trust politicians to put the money where it's supposed to be. And if you're living in a low trust society, your politicians as well are going to be low trust, because the politicians reflect the morality of the people. Because the people will tolerate them. In a democracy and in a republic, the government that you have is what you earned. It is therefore it is therefore as necessary that the state governments should be able to command the means of supplying their wants. So he contends it's necessary the state governments be able to command the means that will fulfill their wants, as the national government should possess the like faculty in respect to the wants of the Union. So national government is supposed to look at the wants of the Union. The other is supposed to see the state governments, the wants of their people. But an indefinite power of taxation in the latter might, and probably would in time, deprive the former of the means of providing for their own necessities. So yes, taxes could be so high on the states that they often will neglect, feel like, let's say the federal government wants so much revenue from the states, federal tax, right, on the individual and whatnot, that the state kind of becomes bankrupt. The states have to be able to provide for their own necessities of their people, tend to them. So the federal government shouldn't overburden the states, and would subject them entirely to the mercy of the national legislature, as the laws of the Union are to become the supreme law of the land. Okay, so the laws of the Union are to become the supreme law of the land. So this is where you see a difference of people who support the federal government supremacy and those who want everything more at a state and local level. As it is to have power to pass all laws that may be necessary for carrying into execution the authorities with which it is proposed to vest it. The vested power on the federal government. The national government might at any time abolish the taxes imposed for state objects, upon the pretense of an interference with its own. Tax cuts are rare now. It might allege a necessity of doing this in order to give efficacy to the national revenues, and thus all the resources of taxation might be degrees become the subjects of federal monopoly, to the entire exclusion and destruction of the state governments. Federal monopoly. This mode of reasoning appears sometimes to turn upon the supposition of usurpation in the national government to usurp authority. At other times it seems to be designed only as a deduction from the constitutional operation of its intended powers. It is only in the latter light that it can be admitted to have any pretensions to fairness. The moment we launch into conjectures about the usurpations of the federal government, we get into an unfathomable abyss and fairly put ourselves out of the reach of all reasoning. So he seems to really be trying to persuade us that the federal government won't be oppressive, there'll be means, but that the federal government shouldn't impede the functions and abilities of the states in terms of maintaining their duties, but states must hand over a national revenue. it'll be necessary in order to preserve the Union. So he really is honing that in for us, that don't be too skeptical in the power of the federal government. But he lived in a different time, I'd argue. Imagination may range at pleasure till it gets bewildered amidst the labyrinths of an enchanted castle, and knows not on which sides to turn to escape from the apparitions. Ooh, notice what he just said here. So he's contending, like, you can imagine all types of horrors of the federal government. Doing so, you can have fun thinking all the bewilderment and the labyrinths of the maze of the mind and all the different what-ifs you can come up with. But those are apparitions. So they're like these untangible ghosts of the mind, in a way he's getting at. It's very saucy language, which itself has raised. So fighting against the own ghosts of your own conjectures. So bringing up strawmans in your head and then feeling spooky about it. So he's, in a very poetic way, mocking the naysayers. Whatever may be the limits or modifications of the powers of the Union, it is easy to imagine an endless train of possible dangers. See? It's easy to imagine an endless train of possible dangers. So he's saying, like, yeah, you could go on and think of all the dangers of the national legislator kind of demanding more revenue or having full control without impediments of taxation. But the government has to protect national security, he's getting at. And by indulging in excess jealousy and timidity, we may bring ourselves to a state of absolute skepticism and irresolution. So don't just be a skeptic for skeptic's sake, a contrarian just to be on the contrary. I repeat here what I have observed in substance in another place, that all observations founded upon the danger of usurpation ought to be referred to the composition and structure of the government, not to the nature or extent of its powers. So, the nature and extent of the powers of the federal government, he's saying, refer yourself to the composition and structure of the government. Composition and structure of the government, not to the nature of the government or the extent of its power. The state governments, by their original constitutions, are invested with complete sovereignty. So here he's pointing out the states have sovereignty over their territories, but there has to be the federal union, which can demand a certain amount of money that will protect all of them, and they cannot get in the way of what the feds do. In what does our security consist against usurpations from that quarter? So it looks to me as if he's trying to say, if a couple of states band together and try to usurp the federal government, those who didn't rebel need to give money in order to protect the whole and to squash the rebellion and maintain the union. So if you want actual security, everyone has to contribute to the pot so that a rebellious state can be stomped out, subdued, not usurp the authority and rebel and not obey. Doubtless in the manner of their formation and in a due dependence of those who are to administer them upon the people. If the proposed construction of the federal government be found, upon an impartial examination of it, to be such as to afford to a proper extent the same species of security, all apprehensions on the score of usurpation ought to be discarded. So, if you want proper security, you need to understand the mode of taxation. And there's tons of ways a state could usurp authority, but you shouldn't dwell on the endless train of possible dangers and bewilder yourself with the apparitions of your own making, he contends. It should not be forgotten that a disposition in the state governments to encroach upon the rights of the Union is quite as probable as a disposition in the Union to encroach upon the rights of the state, the right of the state governments. So, the Union to encroach upon the rights of the state governments. That was a huge fear. It still is. What side would be likely to prevail in such a conflict? So here, what happens when the states fight with the federal government, or the federal government becomes oppressive to the states? Must depend on the means which the contending parties could employ towards ensuring success. So the means for war, raising revenue for war, which say, can the Union raise more money for war, or can the states? As in republic, strength is always on the side of the people. And as there are weighty reasons to induce a belief that the state governments will commonly possess most influence over them, the natural conclusion is that such contests will be most apt to end to the disadvantage of the Union. So if the states are rebelling, it hurts the Union more than it hurts the state, he's contending. And that there is greater probability of encroachments by its members upon the federal head than by the federal head upon the members. Okay, so he's contending it's more probable that the states are going to try to be more rebellious and encroachable than the states to the federal government. Than the government to the states. This seems to be the need for the Second Amendment. The federal government has the military. States, they have armed people who are self-reliant, are less likely to be oppressed. Disarm all the states, now you can't resist the federal government. Federal government is corrupt. Freedom of speech. The states can transmit knowledge and information and argue and have better representatives in the republic, right? To represent them, because there'll be more knowledge and truth exposed. But if the federal government is cutting the Second Amendment, cutting freedom of speech, and oppressing the states, it'll be more difficult for the states to resist, and there won't be a refuge. So if there's one state where they're trying to lead a rebellion, or they want to secede from the Union, and they're trying to encourage the collapse, you would see the federal government start to encroach upon the rights. But then you also see how social media plays a role as well. It's a very interesting conversation. But it is evident that all conjectures of this kind must be extremely vague and fallible, and that it is by far the safest course to lay them altogether aside, and to confine our attention wholly to the nature and extent of the powers as they are delineated in the Constitution. So he's saying, hey, it's a safer course to see how everything's lined out in the Constitution. The Constitution is your roadmap. As he mentioned here, look at the composition and structure of the government as described in the Constitution, not on just the philosophical nature or extent of powers of the government, right? Because if you do that route, he contends, you're going to go through a labyrinth in your own mind about what ifs. Everything beyond this must be left to the prudence and firmness of the people. So exactly, in a republic, the people choose, and if it's sinful, the people made it sinful. Who, as they will hold the scales in their own hands. That's a good point. Yep. It is to be hoped will always take care to preserve the constitutional equilibrium between the general and the state government. So it's really showing here the people. It's your job to preserve the constitutional equilibrium between your state and the government. So a very political mindset, being involved, talking about it. Upon this ground, which is evidently the true one, it will not be difficult to obviate the objections which we have been made to an indefinite power of taxation in the United States. So, indefinite power of taxation to the United States. Publius. So, revenue, taxation, heavy topic. Not easy to deal with. You could go on and on about it. But look at how he talks. And you can see the sense in what he says. But you look at how the corrupt politicians are today, man. The MS warmongering. You can see the blind sides. Look at the behavior of the federal government now. Against different states. So much to examine. How the states now behave. What's legal there? What's not legal there? Where's the federal jurisdiction isn't being applied? Where the states are rebelling against the federal government. right? So much to look at. Very educational. He's such a great writer, though. I will give him that. Master of the English language. If you'd like to join my blog, it's www.subscribestar.com/MilhanArchive. Hope to see you there.